are people aware of, you know, the education of what kind of fender we need to apply, what kind of fender is sufficient for the vessels that are coming into the port? And I'm taking the fender just as part of the whole structure. Is there a need for education? Education towards the user, which are the port authority or the terminal operators. If there is a need, who do you think they should educate, or who should educate them? Is it the contractor? Is it the supplier? Yeah.
So, in my opinion, is the full chain that have to operate in the right way.
Yeah.
Nowadays, knowledge exists, guidelines exist, law systems exist. The framework for contracting is quite clear. And in certain situations, big ports have authorities with very skilled technical staff inside that can help the complete decision-making operation. Sometimes this knowledge lack, but only for the fact that people don't want to access to this kind of information. Organization like PIANC is doing a lot in this sense, trying to spread education, like you are saying. But in my opinion, it's really important to take in account that it's important to work toward the direction to spread this kind of information, helping organization in organizing events, seminars, preparing literature in this sense, like, for instance, PIANC do in the last years.
I think for me there's an interesting contrast between an organisation like PIANC and the work that it does in terms of generating guidelines, which are just guidelines. And then you work in oil and gas, for example, and you have things like API standards, which are more than guidelines. These are standards which are imposed and policed, you know, to the fullest extent. So if you say you comply with API 17 or whatever the number is, then you're responsible for doing that. Whereas the PIANC issues guidelines and there's no sort of legal responsibility or nobody policing it.
No.
But on the other hand, suppliers use PIANC and say we've got PIANC approval. Our thing is PIANC approved in the way that you would with a proper legal standard. And I think there's a big danger.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a PIANC commissioner, and that's part of the. We like to have an open forum that allows internationally across the world to share our experience.
Yeah.
And do that in a way that we aren't fearful that what we're sharing becomes a standard used by somebody, because we don't have any legal authority or responsibility or the staffing to go and police it.
Yeah.
So it's shared knowledge. We'd love to have everybody's input, but it can't be used that way. It's not standard enforced that way.
But it is. I mean, I'm sure you
I
see the same as well.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
On Monday, we had a half-day session on berthing velocity. At that point, some LNG berth has a target berthing velocity. That's why ship understand target berthing velocity. What berthing velocity should be. But that is a rare case. Generally, container terminal doesn't know that knowledge. I think the responsibility is maybe by port authority or government, but that is not only port authority, but also Fender company, and totally we have to thinking about.
But I think that the industry as a whole, the general port industry, so again, using oil and gas as an example of sort of the higher level of standards. Within the oil and gas industry, there's a drive. So the equivalent, I guess, in oil and gas is to have a joint industry project. So you will get all people around the table and collaborate and share information and come up with some guidelines. And then there's a well-defined process of taking those findings and translating them into a standard, an ISO standard or a Euronorm standard or an API, ultimately let's say an API standard. But in the marine industry, the general marine industry, that process doesn't seem to exist. So you put all this information together in a very, very structured and very professional way under the PIANC auspices, but then the next links don't come along.
We have as
Yeah.
design engineers, concrete and steel. We can go right to the legal requirements. When it comes to fenders, I have to rely on the vendors and their engineers to tell me what they put in, how they should perform. And one of the important requirements for me is to look into what guarantee you're going to give me to give my client onto what product I have. So as I weigh that and make those recommendations for performance, that's an important criteria. But it really relies on the trust
But
and reliability.
But there's not many industries where you've got huge pieces of equipment worth millions and millions of dollars, docking with equipment that's worth millions and millions of dollars, and shipping goods that's worth millions of dollars, where you rely upon the word of the supplier. There are usually standards or things that you have to work within that guarantee what you ask for is what you get.
Okay. Elio, do you want to add something?
about the role of the organization in the educational programs for engineers and so on. PIANC, for instance, I sit in board of PIANC, we have a lot of discussion about which is the role of the guidelines, if this have to become standards and so on. We discuss a lot about this. PIANC, for instance, is driving towards its members to support the professional quality of people, because we are intimately convinced that you can have all kind of standards, all kind of situations, but it's truly important, very important to have a high quality of designers, of technical actors involved in the whole chain of the decision.
Yeah.
Only in this way you can ensure that people respect some interesting things that you have to take in account to avoid substandard services. This is the work, for instance, of PIANC every day. And I am convinced too that with the possibility to access of this kind of huge information, when you start with the right fit and ask for correct needings from the owner or operator, good programs, you ask for good tender documents, so to sign all the things that you need. You go through a good installation and operation of the products and services that you are asking for. You do a good supervision. You implement a good maintenance program after of this. I am sure that we can go towards a more clear situation in the future. I know we have to stay in the real world. It is can seem only very, very, very easy, but we have to work together in this direction.
Yeah. Would you give advice or ask advice from Fender manufacturers saying, listen, accident happened at this port, we need to replace it. What is the latest? Do you turn to a supplier? And if you turn to a supplier, do you go to an OEM or are you going to a trader?
Well, one comment I have to that is there's two sides to an incident, if you will. And one is, what was the applied load?
Yeah.
You berthed the Queen Mary where you had a small ferry. I don't care whose Fender it is. Okay?
Yeah.
So understanding the situations that happened, as if it's an abnormal situation, as a designer, my recommendation may be just replace it. But if not, you need to look and make sure the system that's designed matches the criteria of how they want to operate their port. And so then going back to the best source of the information, which to me is in Fenders, is the design engineers that work for that firm that know the materials and have the experience that I would want to go back and get my information for as a redesign.
Yeah, we as consultants, just like you, we rely heavily on good vendors, good manufacturers that we trust, we know we've worked with, built relationships with over the years, and we know those products perform. And I find some of the best information from good industry vendors, and we know who they are, and our clients are paying us to know who those vendors are and work with the best.
It's a highly iterative process, is designing fenders, and the best projects that we're involved in are the projects where we're heavily involved in the project from right at the start of the first concept. So with the consulting engineers, and then it's an iteration. The consulting engineer can't design the key wall without knowing what the fender does. We can't design the fenders without knowing what the vessels do and what the key wall's got to do. So it's a very iterative process, and as I just said, the best, most successful projects that we're involved in, that dialogue is very strong. But there are an awful lot of projects where there's no dialogue whatsoever. All you get is a specification that says you will supply this. There's no so we end up just supplying something with no real knowledge of what the application is and what the function of the fender or the docking and mooring system is or whatever. It's just an item on the shopping list.
And you're a little narrow just to call it a fender.
Yeah.
Because what we're really looking at for performance is energy absorption.
System.
And
system.
Fender's a key component of that, but so's the dock and the piers. Because the fenders or the piles themselves can be a part of that energy absorbing system, the whalers behind it. So looking at one component by itself, you can miss the boat.
And for this reason, perhaps I was thinking that it would be nice shifting the point of view from the CapEx investments to other kind of contracts for this kind of services. I am calling service the pressure control that affect the performance of the entire port. So being an important service, perhaps could be interesting to think to all-inclusive contract, for instance. I discuss with my tender documents with people that is in condition to give all the chain of that complete the service from the concept phase until the disposal at the end of life of the product. This is also healthy for environmental.
That's quite an interesting point. So we're involved in some LNG projects with Petrobras, and they're actually starting to look at projects from that sort of whole life cycle thing. So at the same time as you're bidding for the equipment, to supply the equipment, you're also bidding to supply a service contract for maybe 5 years or 10 years, something like that. And then it's viewed all together as a whole. And for me, that's exactly what we want to do, because yes, it means you've still got to be competitive and all these things, but it means that the people making decisions are looking at everything all at the same time. And quite often, one of the issues with CapEx spending and OpEx spending is it's completely different people, completely different budgets. And the CapEx people have got CapEx and they've got $1 million to spend, and they don't want to spend $1 more, or they want to save every dollar they can out of the $1 million. But the OpEx people are a different breed. It's a bit like you were saying in Spain. The budgets for OpEx haven't really changed throughout the crisis.
Those probably not even involved in the project anymore. They're involved in the early implementation, and then you have the operators years later that have to spend and deal with this legacy of this project.
So an interesting question for us as suppliers, I guess, is how do we get that engagement going with you guys as consultants? Ultimately, you're representing the port owners and the operator and things like that. How do we provide better support to do that?
But on the other hand, it is important that in the case of Fender, it's quite clear, there is not at this moment a clear quality criteria. I mean, you can go with your Fender and say, this Fender provides the reaction that the manufacturer says, yes. It can absorb the energy, yes. And maybe it's like if you go to buy a car, you can go to the best one to a normal car. both of them has 4 wheels, an engine, and they are completely different. So the problem is, which is the criteria, and how can be established a quality criteria?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it all comes back to what's established early in the project. When the project is in its conceptual phase and its front-end engineering phase, what is the standards that are being applied? And that has to carry on all the way through to construction and commissioning.
I have experience in write down some specifications, and I cannot decide from one provider.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
all of us have an opinion about, and you try to get the best for your client and
Right.
to write down and to define as much as possible the requirements of the equipment. But at the end, the contractor can get the same from another provider.
Yeah.
And you really know that it is not the best one, but it complies with.
So
Yeah,
it sort of goes back to
Yeah.
Elio's point again, though. It's about education, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about
Mm.
education, and it's
Yeah,
about
exactly.
having clever people with the right training, selecting the right pieces of equipment.
Well, you ask how you could help. Scott puts together specifications, right? And if you help us prepare specifications in a way that allows competition,
Yeah.
but clearly differentiates what's a quality from a not quality fender
Yeah.
by the durometer, the hardness, the materials that we can put in our specifications and stand behind and understand as engineers, you've helped our clients as well as
Absolutely.
Yeah,
all
yeah.
of us.